She gave her daughter the last piece of bread, then passed out at work. Hours later, a billionaire CEO learned it was the woman he never stopped thinking about. Alexander Blake was used to control. He was a man who scheduled his days to the minute, who never arrived late, and who never noticed much beyond boardrooms, contracts, and private jets. But that afternoon, as he pulled up to the private school where his 6-year-old daughter Emma attended, something out of the ordinary pulled him out of his world of numbers and decisions. He had expected to see her waiting as always, neatly dressed, holding her pink backpack and smiling. Instead, she was sitting on the low stone ledge near the school's front gate, her legs swinging idly as she leaned toward another little girl who was crying quietly. The other girl was clearly not a student at this expensive school. Her clothes were simpler, worn but clean, a light blue dress that was slightly wrinkled, a yellow backpack that looked too big on her small frame. Her long brown hair framed her tear-streaked face as she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Emma sat beside her, not speaking, just offering her a red apple from her lunchbox. The act was so natural, so quiet and unassuming, that Alexander almost missed it. He got out of the car, leaving the door open behind him, and approached slowly, puzzled and concerned. As he neared, Emma looked up at him with her usual calm expression, as if what she was doing needed no explanation. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft but steady, her mommy didn't come to get her. "She's scared to go home alone." The other girl flinched when he got closer, but Emma gently reached out and touched her shoulder as if to say it was okay. Alexander crouched down, leveling himself with the two girls. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, directing the question gently toward the stranger. The girl sniffled and hesitated. "Sophie," she said barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded, trying to mask the sudden tightness in his chest. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing a child so young, sitting alone, abandoned in a world that was clearly too big for her. He looked at Emma, then back at Sophie. "Do you know where your mom is?" Sophie bit her lip and glanced down at her shoes. "She got sick at work. Someone said she fainted. An ambulance came. I don't know where they took her." She wasn't crying anymore, just sitting there with that quiet, empty voice children sometimes use when they're trying to sound strong. Alexander didn't know what moved him more, Sophie's small voice or the way Emma instinctively wrapped an arm around her. He stood up slowly, pulled out his phone, and called his driver. In a clipped tone, he gave the man instructions to call nearby hospitals, asking for anyone named Laura King who had been admitted in the last few hours. Then he sat down on the ledge beside the girls. He didn't say much. He just waited with them, one hand resting gently on Emma's shoulder, the other typing names into search engines, listening to the city move around them while two small lives sat quietly, connected by an apple and unexpected compassion. The car ride to the hospital was unusually quiet. Sophie sat in the back seat between Emma and Alexander, clutching her worn yellow backpack tightly to her chest like a lifeline. Her small fingers were trembling, but she didn't cry. Emma, ever intuitive for her age, gently took Sophie's hand without saying a word. Alexander glanced at them through the rearview mirror, a strange heaviness sitting in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't business stress. It wasn't irritation or pressure. It was something deeper, something personal and unfamiliar, like guilt and responsibility twisted together. Earlier, his driver had confirmed that a woman named Laura King had been admitted to Westbrook General Hospital, unconscious from what appeared to be dehydration and overwork. When he heard the name, something stirred in Alexander's memory, but he couldn't place it yet. The moment had been too quick, too far in the past. Now, as they pulled up to the entrance of the emergency department, he saw the sterile glass doors slide open and felt an odd sense of dread. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as the three of them approached the front desk. The receptionist barely looked up until Alexander said the name Laura King. The woman's expression changed almost immediately. "She's conscious now," she said, looking at Sophie with recognition. "You can go in, room 204, straight down the hall to the left." Sophie let go of Emma's hand and hesitated. Her eyes moved to Alexander, as if asking if she was allowed to go. He gave a small nod. Go ahead. We'll be right behind you. Sophie ran. It was the first time Alexander saw her move with anything like confidence, and it was startling. He followed more slowly with Emma beside him, unsure of what to expect. The door to room 204 was slightly ajar, and through it he saw a pale, fragile-looking woman sitting upright in bed, and 4 in her arm. Her hair was dark brown, tied in a loose bun, her eyes tired but alive. When Sophie entered, the woman's face lit up, not with energy, but with relief so deep it was almost painful to witness. She pulled her daughter into her arms and held her tightly, whispering, "I'm okay, baby. I'm here." Alexander stood silently in the doorway. For a moment, he didn't want to intrude. But then the woman looked up, and froze. Her eyes widened. A beat of recognition passed between them, and suddenly he remembered where he had seen her before. Years ago, she had interned in his office. Bright, focused, always staying late and asking thoughtful questions. Her name had passed his desk once when HR circulated a list of staff being let go during a downsizing. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now here she was, frail and exhausted, clinging to a child who had asked strangers for help because she had no one else to call. "Mr. Blake," she asked, voice hoarse but clear. He nodded. "Yes. I found Sophie outside the school. Emma was with her." She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. "I never wanted this. I didn't know who else to ask. I passed out. I haven't eaten properly in days. I couldn't afford to miss another shift, but my body gave up." Alexander stepped into the room and sat on the nearby chair, suddenly unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, but the scene before him made him feel exactly that. "You don't have to explain," he said quietly. "I want to help." She looked at him, tired and skeptical. "Why?" The question hung there like a challenge, like a wall she had every right to put up. He didn't have an answer. Not one that would fit in a sentence. But he looked at Emma, who stood silently beside him, and he looked at Sophie, curled into her mother's arms, and he said, "Because someone has to." Laura didn't say much after that, and neither did Alexander. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick with everything that couldn't be easily spoken aloud, her exhaustion, his confusion, the fragile thread that had suddenly connected their lives. The nurses came in and out, checking her vitals, adjusting her making notes. Sophie never left her mother's side. She sat curled against her, eyes alert, as if afraid that if she looked away, Laura might disappear again. Emma stayed close to Alexander, occasionally glancing at him as if trying to understand what was really going on. It wasn't until nearly an hour later, after a doctor confirmed that Laura would be discharged the next day, that Alexander finally stood and quietly asked if he could speak to her alone. Laura looked down at Sophie and gently asked her to go show Emma the coloring book on the table. The two girls walked to the far corner of the room, still in earshot but happily distracted. Alexander sat back down in the chair beside her bed. "I know this probably feels sudden," he began, "and I don't want to overstep anything, but I want to understand what happened. Not just today. The whole picture." Laura didn't answer right away. She looked out the small hospital window, where the sunlight was beginning to fade behind a line of gray buildings. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but firm. "After I lost the internship at your company, I tried to stay in the industry. But no one was hiring someone without a degree and experience. I was juggling part-time classes and 2 jobs. Then Sophie got sick one winter. It was pneumonia. I missed a week of work, and I lost everything. The apartment, the part-time job, and eventually school too. I ended up cleaning offices and waiting tables just to keep her fed. We've been in and out of shelters. I got us a small place now, but it's barely enough to cover rent and groceries." Alexander listened, stunned. He had no idea. She wasn't the kind of person who asked for help. Even now, she told her story without self-pity. She was just stating facts, facts of a life that had unraveled quietly while the world moved on. "I'm not trying to guilt you," she added, as if reading his expression. I've been alone a long time. I didn't think I could expect anything from anyone. Not anymore. I'm not here out of guilt," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And I'm not here just because of Emma. Or Sophie. I'm here because I saw a little girl sharing her lunch with another who had no idea if her mom was okay or not. And I realized I've been living a very small life, in a very big way." Laura turned to look at him then, "Really look. You don't owe us anything." "I know," he said. "But maybe I want to give something anyway." They didn't come to any decisions that evening. He offered to pay for temporary childcare while she recovered. She declined at first but eventually accepted when he explained it came with no strings attached. He didn't even push her to leave the hospital with him. Instead, he left his driver's card, his private number, and promised to check on them in the morning. That night, Alexander sat alone in his penthouse apartment, looking out over the glittering skyline that usually filled him with pride. But now it felt sterile and meaningless. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Sophie had clung to her mother's hospital gown, the quiet way Laura had told him she used to skip meals just to keep her daughter fed. For years he had measured success in profits and mergers. But now he was beginning to suspect that everything he had built meant very little if it couldn't offer safety to someone like them. He thought of Emma, who had acted with more empathy than he had in years, and he wondered, not for the first time that night, if maybe it was time for him to start becoming someone his daughter would be proud to grow up with. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the hospital earlier than he expected. He hadn't planned to come in person, but something pulled him there, a quiet urgency he couldn't quite explain. When he stepped into room 204, he found Laura already dressed in her clothes from the previous day, sitting upright on the bed while Sophie brushed her hair with a plastic comb from a hospital care kit. There was something striking about the scene, how calm it felt, how intimate and vulnerable yet dignified. Laura looked up when she saw him and gave a faint smile, still weary but more composed than she had been the night before. "I didn't think you'd come back yourself," she said quietly, her voice softer in the morning light. "Most people in your position would have sent a car or an assistant. I thought you deserved better than a stranger knocking on your door with instructions," Alexander replied. He glanced down at Sophie, who was now carefully packing up her mother's things into a hospital tote bag. "Besides, I promised I'd check in." He hesitated, then added, "And I keep my promises." Laura stood slowly, clearly still a little unsteady, and reached for the discharge papers on the table. "We're good to go. They cleared me with a warning, I'm dangerously close to full burnout, which I already knew. But at least I have a second chance to fix it." "Not alone," he said, and handed her a folder. Inside were several documents, arrangements for a temporary apartment closer to a good school, a schedule for medical checkups, a recommendation letter from him personally, and a prepaid account for groceries. Laura stared at it without touching it. "I don't want to owe you," she said after a moment. "You won't," Alexander said. "You're not a charity case. This is what people do when they care. And maybe I didn't do enough of that in my life before. But I can now." There was a long pause between them. Sophie looked up and gently placed her small hand into her mother's. "Mommy, can we go with him?" she asked innocently. Laura closed her eyes and nodded, more to herself than to anyone else. Alexander took them first to a quiet cafe near the hospital. It wasn't part of his original plan, but he thought maybe a warm breakfast would help make everything feel more human and less like a transaction. He ordered pancakes for the girls and tea for Laura, sitting across from them in a booth that suddenly felt like the center of his entire day. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't business. It was real. Laura slowly began to open up more. Over scrambled eggs and toast, she told him about the little apartment they had been living in, a studio with one bed and a small heater that broke every other week. She explained how hard it was to get stable work when she had to juggle school pickups and night shifts, and how often she went without meals so Sophie wouldn't have to. Alexander listened to every word, not with the mind of a CEO scanning for numbers or flaws, but as a man trying to learn what he had ignored for far too long. "I've made mistakes," he admitted quietly. "I've built a world that's designed to keep people like me safe from seeing this kind of struggle. Maybe I told myself that was smart. But I see now it's just lonely. And cowardly." Laura didn't respond immediately. She reached for her tea and stirred it slowly, watching the tiny whirlpool form inside the cup. "It's hard to trust," she said eventually. "You've lived in a different world. And even now, I keep waiting for the part where all this disappears." "It won't," Alexander said. "Not unless you ask me to disappear." They left the cafe together later that morning. He walked them to the new apartment, small, but warm, freshly cleaned and already stocked with a few essentials. Laura looked around, speechless, while Sophie ran from room to room, delighted by the simple fact that she had her own space. A real bed. A closet. A window with curtains. Alexander stood by the door, watching them, and felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't just about making amends or being kind. It was about the slow realization that these moments, this family he'd stumbled into, was something he wanted to be a part of, not just support from a distance. Before he left, he knelt down to speak to Sophie. "If you need anything," he said gently, "you call me, okay? Anytime." She nodded, serious and grateful in a way only children can be. And when he looked up at Laura, he saw that her eyes were no longer filled with doubt, but something far more complicated, something close to hope. Over the next few weeks, the rhythm of their lives began to change in subtle but undeniable ways. Laura started her part-time role at Alexander's foundation, a position he created not out of pity but because it was clear she had insight and strength that couldn't be learned in a boardroom. She wasn't just efficient, she was fiercely determined, and more than once, she pointed out blind spots in the foundation's community outreach programs that his top advisors had never even considered. Alexander noticed, and he listened. More importantly, he made sure she knew he was listening, which was something he hadn't done for anyone in a long time. Meanwhile, Sophie and Emma grew closer every day. They attended the same school, sat side by side in class, and became inseparable during recess. Their bond was not just built on friendship, but a quiet understanding of each other's worlds. Emma, raised with every advantage, began to see life from a new perspective through Sophie's eyes. And Sophie, once quiet and cautious, began to laugh more freely and speak with more confidence. At home, the two girls drew pictures together, made messy art projects that cluttered Laura's kitchen counters, and filled the apartment with a sense of childhood that had been missing for too long. Alexander visited often. At first, he told himself it was just to check in, to make sure the transition was going smoothly, that the apartment was functioning, that Sophie had everything she needed. But those check-ins became longer, more frequent. He would bring dinner, sometimes groceries, or small things he thought Sophie might like, a new set of crayons, a storybook about a curious girl who traveled the world, a pair of matching hair clips for the girls. And each time he left, he would find it harder to close the door behind him. One rainy evening, after staying for dinner, Alexander lingered longer than usual. Laura had made pasta, nothing fancy, but warm and comforting, and the girls had fallen asleep in the living room with a movie still playing on low volume. The apartment was quiet except for the rain tapping softly against the windows. Laura stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, while Alexander dried them. The domesticity of the moment struck him. It wasn't something he had felt in years. He had homes in 4 cities, with views that people envied, but not once had he dried dishes with someone while children slept nearby and the world felt paused in a way that invited peace. He broke the silence gently. "You've built a beautiful life, Laura. Even with everything you've faced, you've raised an incredible daughter." Laura paused for a second before replying. It hasn't been beautiful most of the time. It's been hard. Lonely. Some nights, I didn't know how I was going to feed her the next day. I've had to say no to things I didn't want to. I've hated myself for not being enough. But I never stopped trying. He nodded, deeply moved. I can see that. And I think Sophie sees it, too. She's proud of you. Anyone would be. She looked at him then, for a moment too long, and he knew something was shifting between them. The air felt heavier, not with tension, but with the possibility of something neither of them had allowed themselves to hope for. Yet Laura pulled back, emotionally if not physically, and turned away to wipe her hands. I'm afraid of this, Alexander, she admitted quietly. Of you. Of what this could turn into. I don't want Sophie to get hurt. I don't want to get hurt. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, honest. I'm afraid too. But I'm here anyway. I'm not going to disappear. And I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. The quiet returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds unspoken truths, the kind that says maybe, just maybe, there is something real blooming in a place where no one expected it. Before leaving that night, Alexander gently covered the girls with a blanket, looked at Laura once more, and simply said, "Good night." She nodded, watching him go, the sound of the door closing far softer than it had ever been. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to wonder what it would feel like to let someone stay. The following week unfolded like a slow, unexpected tide pulling both Laura and Alexander into something deeper than either of them had planned. The casual dinners turned into routine. Alexander began showing up not just in the evenings but sometimes in the middle of the day with coffee or takeout, or simply. It had been almost 2 months since that rainy evening when Alexander first allowed himself to feel something real again, something grounded not in success or power but in shared moments and quiet honesty. The visits continued, but no longer with the pretense of business. He came because he wanted to be there, because he missed the sound of Sophie's laughter when she told him about her school day, because Emma began to ask if Mr. Blake was coming over for dinner again, and because Laura, though still guarded, had stopped flinching when he offered to help wash the dishes or bring groceries by unannounced. One Saturday morning, Alexander suggested something unexpected, a day trip to the aquarium. It wasn't lavish or extravagant. He rented a modest van, packed snacks with Emma's help, and even brought along 2 extra umbrellas in case the weather turned. When they arrived, Sophie's eyes lit up in a way that made Laura smile so sincerely it stunned him. It wasn't just about the fish or the glowing jellyfish or the massive sea turtles gliding through the water. It was about being treated like a family. About not needing to worry about how much the tickets cost or whether there would be enough money left for lunch afterward. Laura watched Alexander all day. She saw how he knelt down to read exhibit signs with the girls, how he made sure to hold Sophie's hand if they were in a crowd, how he never once made her feel like she owed him anything. But the fear still lingered. She had built so many walls over the past years to protect her daughter, and herself. She wasn't sure if she knew how to let them down without risking everything. That evening, after the girls fell asleep in the back seat during the drive home, Laura spoke without looking at him. "This isn't easy for me. Letting someone in. Trusting again. I've had to carry everything alone for so long, and now, there's you. And I don't know how to let myself want this." Alexander didn't answer right away. He focused on the road, the glow of the dashboard reflecting softly on his face. "I don't want you to rush anything," he said finally. "I'm not asking for answers today. I just want to be someone who shows up. Who stays. And if someday you want more than that, I'll be here." Back at the apartment, he helped carry the sleeping girls inside, carefully laying them in bed without waking them. Laura lingered at the doorway of Sophie's room, arms crossed, watching them breathe. She spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I don't know how long this peace will last. Life has a way of changing everything when you least expect it." He nodded. That's why we don't waste the moments when it's here. The following week brought an unexpected shift. Laura was offered a full-time role at the foundation. Not from Alexander, but from the board itself. Based on the work she had already done, her impact was undeniable. It was a moment of validation she hadn't realized she needed. That evening, after the girls were asleep again, she poured 2 cups of tea and joined Alexander at the small kitchen table. "I'm scared," she said, not dramatically, but plainly. He met her gaze. "So am I. But I'd rather be scared with you than comfortable alone." For the first time, Laura let herself believe that maybe this man wasn't going to vanish. Maybe the world wouldn't fall apart just because she allowed herself to feel something again. As the quiet evening stretched into night, and the girls stirred gently in their beds, something unspoken began to settle between them. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't love declared. But it was a beginning. A real one. One built not on fantasy, but on the quiet, determined act of showing up day after day, for each other, and for the small, hopeful family they were slowly becoming. Spring arrived slowly, painting the city in soft pastels and warmer winds, but for Laura, everything still felt uncertain beneath the surface. There were mornings when she would wake up and feel a quiet panic press against her chest, as if it was all too good to last: the steady job, the peaceful home, Sophie's constant smile, Alexander's growing presence. She had built a life on caution, on survival, on waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now, when there were no shoes dropping and no doors slamming, she didn't quite know how to exist. It scared her more than the chaos ever had. Alexander, meanwhile, continued to show up in quiet, consistent ways. He didn't try to impress or overwhelm her. Instead, he learned what mattered. He remembered the way she liked her tea, the kinds of books Sophie preferred to read before bed, and that Laura never liked surprises, unless they came with pastries. He began to rearrange parts of his schedule, slowly, without making it obvious. Evening meetings became rare. His phone stayed on silent during dinner. Sometimes he would even take Emma and Sophie to the park by himself, just so Laura could have a couple hours alone, something she hadn't experienced in years. But as their bond deepened, so did the weight of unspoken things. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, Laura sat beside him on the small living room couch while the girls played in the hallway. She was quiet, her expression unreadable, until she finally said, "I keep waiting for you to realize this is too messy for you. That we're too messy. That you could walk away and go back to your clean, predictable world and forget all of this happened." Alexander didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked, and then said, "I've had clean and predictable. It was empty. This isn't messy to me. It's honest. It's real. And if I ever walk away from that, I'd be more lost than I've ever been." She didn't respond, but her hand found his on the couch cushion and stayed there. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense, not yet. But it was something stronger, a trust slowly forming where none had existed before. That night, after the girls were asleep and the apartment was silent, Laura stood in the kitchen staring out the small window at the streetlights below. Alexander came in to say goodnight, expecting her usual quiet nod, but instead she turned and said softly, "Would you stay? Just for a while. I don't want to be alone tonight." He didn't make a move or say anything suggestive. He just nodded and followed her to the couch, where they sat in silence. At some point, she fell asleep leaning against him, and he stayed perfectly still, afraid that even shifting his weight might break the fragile trust between them. He watched her breathe, her face finally relaxed in sleep, and realized that in all his years of striving, of chasing success and status, he had never felt more grounded than in that quiet room with nothing but the hum of a refrigerator and the soft weight of a woman who had survived far more than he could ever imagine. The next morning, when she woke up and found him still there, already brewing coffee and helping Sophie get dressed for school, something broke open in her. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood in the doorway, watching, and let herself believe that maybe this wasn't temporary. Maybe this was a man who would stay, not because he needed to be a hero, but because he had finally found a place where he could be fully human. By the time summer arrived, the changes in their lives had become part of a quiet new rhythm. What had once felt like coincidence or temporary support now grew into something more stable, more rooted, as if they had been building it all along without fully realizing it. Laura found herself smiling more easily, not out of politeness or necessity but from a real sense of peace. Her job at the foundation continued to evolve. She wasn't just helping with outreach now, but shaping entire projects, particularly those aimed at supporting single mothers and working families. Her story had become the catalyst for programs she never imagined she would one day lead. And Alexander, who had spent most of his adult life measuring value in profit margins and boardroom wins, now found himself watching school plays and helping with homework, discovering a depth of fulfillment that could never be bought or negotiated. Their days became filled with small, meaningful moments. Sunday breakfasts where the girls mixed pancake batter while arguing about which toppings to use. Evenings where Laura would lean against the kitchen counter, sipping tea, while Alexander read to Sophie and Emma on the couch. Weekends at the park, where they laughed like any other family, unnoticed by the world that once felt so distant and unrelatable. And sometimes, at night, when the girls were asleep and the apartment was wrapped in stillness, Laura and Alexander would talk. Not about work or the past, but about fears and hopes and the quiet miracle of how their lives had collided. Slowly, cautiously, their affection deepened. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was solid, built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the simple choice to keep showing up for each other every day. But life, as always, had a way of testing what was real. One afternoon, Laura received a call from a lawyer she hadn't heard from in years. It was about Sophie's biological father, a man who had vanished before Sophie's birth and had never once attempted contact. Now, after all this time, he had filed a motion claiming parental rights. The news hit Laura like a punch to the chest. Not because she feared losing Sophie, she knew she would fight with everything she had, but because it brought back every doubt, every insecurity, every buried fear that she would never be enough. She told Alexander everything that night, pacing the living room while he sat calmly, letting her speak. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it immediately. He just listened, fully, and then stood, walked over to her, and said, "You are not alone. We're in this together." She collapsed into his arms, finally allowing herself to cry. It wasn't just about the legal threat, it was about the years of holding everything together with no one to catch her if she fell. With Alexander's help, she hired the best attorney in the city. Not out of wealth, but out of belief. He never treated it like a favor. He made it clear that Sophie was not just Laura's daughter anymore, she was part of all their lives. The court case took weeks. It was tense, emotional, exhausting. But when it was over, the judge ruled in Laura's favor. The man who had abandoned his responsibilities had no ground to stand on. Sophie was safe. The day they received the verdict, Laura didn't cry. She sat quietly in the courtyard outside the courthouse, with Sophie on her lap and Alexander's hand resting on her shoulder. She looked at the man beside her, who had once been a stranger, and saw the partner she never dared to hope for. Not a savior. Not a fantasy. But a man who had chosen her, chosen Sophie, and chosen the messy, beautiful life they were building, one morning, one meal, one laugh at a time. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Laura and Alexander sat together on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the warm breeze. She leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I used to think life had to be hard to be real. That if I let it get too easy, it would disappear. But I think maybe I was just too used to pain to recognize peace." He didn't reply right away. He just kissed the top of her head and held her closer. And in that silence, in that small apartment with its chipped paint and second-hand furniture, they found something worth more than anything either of them had ever owned: home. This story's ending carries a rare kind of emotional weight, the kind that doesn't rely on fantasy, but on deeply human growth. What makes it powerful is not that everything ends perfectly, but that every character earns their peace through resilience, humility, and connection. Laura's journey from survival mode to stability is profoundly moving because it's quiet and real. She doesn't become rescued, she's respected. And Alexander's transformation, from a man focused on success to one who learns the value of presence and empathy, shows that redemption doesn't have to be loud or dramatic, it can be steady, even gentle. What stands out most is how love in this story isn't about grand gestures, but about everyday choices, showing up, staying late, listening when it's hard, and choosing family over ego. The ending is satisfying because it feels lived in. It's not a fairy tale, it's better. It's a story about second chances that feels earned. About people who break, bend, and rebuild. And for a world full of uncertainty, that's a kind of happy ending that truly resonates.